So we're back in the thick of it down here in Texas. Another legislative session, another massive wave of bills hitting the floor, covering everything from healthcare to casinos to criminal justice, just a huge range of topics. It can be tough to get a clear picture of what Texans really think about all these things.
Absolutely. It feels like public opinion can get lost in all the political noise.
Right, exactly. That's why I think the data we're looking at today is so valuable. It's a recent poll conducted by the Barbara Jordan Public Policy Research and Survey Center at Texas Southern University. They surveyed over 1,200 registered voters here in Texas, and importantly, they made a point of getting a large sample of Black voters, which is going to let us get into some really interesting nuances in the data.
Yeah, that oversampling is key. It lets us move beyond just those typical statewide averages and dig deeper into the perspectives of different communities, see where there's alignment and where there's some real divergence of opinions. The overall margin of error for the poll was plus or minus 2.83%, and for the Black voter oversample, it was plus or minus 4.58%.
So a really solid sample size. And with that oversampling, we can really explore those internal variations within the Black community, which often get overlooked. I'm really interested to see what this data tells us. The survey ran from February 6th to the 16th of this year, so very recent. They focused on 8 of the biggest legislative issues in play right now: abortion, marijuana, Medicaid expansion, gun policy, casino gambling, prison vocational training, arrests for minor traffic violations, and immigration.
And they didn't stop there. They also asked about the 2024 presidential vote, which gives us a really interesting point of comparison to these current policy debates.
Yeah, a great way to ground everything in the actual political landscape. Okay, well, let's jump right in. One of the hottest button issues, abortion legislation. What did this poll tell us about where Texans stand?
Well, the statewide picture is pretty mixed. 28% say abortion should always be legal without any restrictions. Then you've got 25% who believe it should be legal, but with some restrictions. A larger group, 34%, think it should only be legal in special circumstances, and then 13% say it should always be illegal.
So a pretty fractured landscape there. What happens when we zero in on Black Texans' views on abortion? Do their opinions align with those statewide numbers, or do we see something different?
This is where things get really interesting. 44% of Black Texans believe abortion should always be legal without restrictions.
Wow, that's significantly higher than the overall state average.
Exactly. It's also noticeably higher than the 26% of Latino Texans and 25% of white Texans who share that view. So right away, we're seeing a distinct perspective emerging.
That suggests a different set of values or experiences shaping their views on abortion rights. Now, I'm curious, when we look within the Black community itself, is there a uniform opinion on this issue, or do we see variation based on other factors?
Definitely not a monolithic viewpoint. You see some really interesting differences based on gender, for example. Black women are significantly more likely to believe abortion should always be legal. We're talking 50% for women versus 33% for men.
So a pretty substantial gap there between Black men and women on the issue of abortion access. Were there any other notable differences within the Black community?
Age is another major factor. 56% of Black Texans under 35 support unrestricted legality, but that number drops to 34% for those 55 and older.
Makes you wonder how much generational experiences and shifts in social attitudes are influencing those numbers. Now, what about the role of political affiliation and religious beliefs? Did those impact opinions on abortion within the Black community?
Absolutely. We see that classic partisan divide, with Black Democrats much more likely to support abortion rights. 49% of them believe it should always be legal, compared to only 16% of Black Republicans. Religion also plays a role, especially when we look at Black born-again Christians. Only 22% of them support unrestricted legality, and they're actually more likely to favor abortion only in special circumstances. That's 42% of them compared to just 12% of other Black Christians. So the intersection of religion and views on abortion is definitely at play here.
Wow, so even within a single racial group, these issues can get incredibly nuanced depending on all these other dimensions of identity. It's a reminder that broad demographic categories don't tell the whole story. Okay, let's shift gears to another topic that generates a lot of debate. Marijuana legalization. What did this poll reveal about Texans' views on that?
Well, statewide, a majority of Texans, 55% to be exact, think marijuana should be legal for both medical and recreational use.
So a clear preference for some form of legalization.
Yeah, and then you've got another 28% who support medical use only, and only 17% believe it shouldn't be legal at all.
Okay, so how do Black Texans' views line up with those statewide trends on marijuana?
Black Texans show an even stronger preference for legalization across the board. 73% of them support both medical and recreational use. That's compared to 53% of white Texans and 48% of Latino Texans.
That's pretty substantial. So again, a clear divergence from those overall state numbers. When you look within the Black community itself, were there any differences of opinion on marijuana legalization?
The biggest difference we observed was age. It's pretty striking, actually. A huge 91% of Black Texans under 35 support full legalization.
Wow, that's overwhelming support from younger Black Texans.
It is, but that number falls to 57% for those 55 and older. So a pretty dramatic generational gap on this one.
Yeah, seems like that generational divide is a recurring theme. There was also a slight difference based on location, with higher support in urban areas like Harris County and Dallas-Tarrant counties, but the age gap was definitely the most prominent factor.
Yeah, that really jumps out at you. Makes you think about how lived experiences with marijuana laws might vary across generations.
Absolutely. Okay, moving on to healthcare, specifically Medicaid expansion. This has been a point of contention in Texas for years. How did Texans feel about it, according to this poll?
So overall, 51% of Texans support expanding Medicaid, under the Affordable Care Act. That's compared to 31% who want to keep it as it is, and then 18% who are unsure.
Okay, so a clear majority in favor of expansion statewide. What about within the Black community? Did they align with that, or did they have a different perspective?
Black Texans show even stronger support. 73% of them favor expansion, compared to 48% of white Texans and 51% of Latino Texans.
That's a pretty significant difference. What do you think is driving that?
Well, it raises questions about how different communities perceive the role of government in providing health care.
Right, different experiences with the healthcare system, different levels of access, different levels of trust in government institutions. All these things likely play a role. Did you notice any internal differences on this issue within the Black community itself?
We did see a slight difference between Black men and women on this one. 76% of Black women support expansion, compared to 67% of Black men. While that is a difference, both groups showed pretty strong support.
Yeah, it highlights those subtle gender dynamics again. Okay, let's move on to another really important topic, one that's been at the forefront of national conversations: gun policy. What did the poll reveal about Texans' overall views on firearm sales laws?
Statewide, it's a fairly divided issue. 46% of Texans believe these laws should be more strict, while 41% think they should stay as they are. And then there's a smaller group, 13%, who think they should be less strict. So, a real mix of opinions there.
It's a really complex issue with a lot of different perspectives, and it's certainly been a focal point for political debate. Now, when we focus on Black Texans, how did their views on gun control align with those statewide figures?
Black Texans are overwhelmingly in favor of stricter gun laws. A whopping 73% of them believe they should be made more strict. That's a huge difference compared to the 39% of white Texans and 47% of Latino Texans who hold that view.
Really striking difference there. What do you think's driving that gap in opinion?
Well, it really underscores how different communities might be experiencing gun violence or perceiving the effectiveness of different public safety approaches.
Right, their lived realities might be quite different, leading to different policy preferences. Now, were there any interesting divisions within the Black community itself on this issue of gun control?
Yeah, we see those familiar dividing lines again. Black women are much more likely to support stricter gun laws than Black men. We're talking 84% for women versus 54% for men. And political affiliation also plays a huge role, as you might expect. 79% of Black Democrats favor stricter laws, compared to only 28% of Black Republicans. So again, we're seeing how these issues cut across racial lines, influenced by gender and political views.
It's a reminder that public opinion is rarely simple or one-dimensional. Okay, let's switch gears to something a little lighter, shall we? Casino gambling. There's been talk of allowing Las Vegas-style casinos here in Texas. What do Texans think about that?
Overall, there's a lot of support for it. 62% of Texans are in favor of allowing a limited number of those big destination resort casinos in major cities, while 38% are opposed.
Okay, so a pretty clear majority in favor statewide. What about within the Black community? Did they share that enthusiasm?
Black Texans are actually even a bit more enthusiastic about casino gambling, with 69% in favor. That's compared to 61% of white Texans and 56% of Latino Texans.
Interesting. So a bit more support there, but not a huge difference. Were there any significant variations within the Black community on this issue?
On this one, no. We didn't find any major differences in opinion based on gender, age, education, or religion. Support for casino gambling seems to be pretty consistent across those subgroups within the Black community.
Huh. So that's a bit of an outlier compared to some of the other issues we've talked about. Maybe there's less of a moral or social dimension to it, less of a history that's shaping opinions in different ways. All right, let's turn to an issue that seems to have pretty broad support across the board. Increasing funding for prison vocational training programs. What did the poll tell us about that?
This is where we see really strong consensus, which is kind of refreshing given how divided people are on some of these other issues. 85% of all Texans support increasing funding for those programs that aim to equip inmates with job skills before they're released.
Yeah, it just makes sense. Giving people the tools they need to succeed after they leave prison seems like a win-win for everyone. Did Black Texans share that view?
Absolutely, and even more so. A huge 91% of them favor increased funding for these programs.
Wow, 91%. That's incredible. It suggests a really strong belief in the power of rehabilitation and second chances.
It does. And honestly, it's encouraging to see such widespread agreement on something like this. It hints at the potential for bipartisan support for criminal justice reform.
I hope so. Okay, let's talk about another aspect of the criminal justice system. Arrests for fine-only traffic offenses. These are those minor violations that often result in tickets and fines. There's been some debate about whether those should automatically lead to arrests. What do Texans think about this?
Well, opinions are a bit more divided on this issue. 56% of Texans support putting limits on those types of arrests for those minor traffic violations, while 44% are opposed.
Okay, so a bit more of a split. What about Black Texans' perspectives on this aspect of law enforcement?
Their level of support is actually quite similar to the overall average. 52% of Black Texans are in favor of those limits. So on this issue, it seems like there's not a huge difference in opinion compared to the general Texan population.
Interesting, so more alignment there. But were there any notable differences within the Black community itself?
Yes, we did see a pretty significant age-based difference on this one. But Black Texans under 35 are much more likely to support limits on arrests for minor traffic violations. That's 65% of them, compared to only 42% of those 55 and older.
So that generational divide is popping up again, even in the context of law enforcement practices. All right, let's tackle what's often a really tough and divisive issue: deportation of undocumented immigrants. What did this poll uncover about the range of opinions across Texas?
Well, you see a pretty broad spectrum of views, which reflects the complexity of this issue. 35% of Texans believe all undocumented immigrants should be deported. Then you've got 24% who think all should be deported except for children and those with U.S. citizen ties. And 33% believe only those who've committed crimes should be deported. And then there's a smaller group, 8%, who believe no undocumented immigrants should be deported, regardless of the circumstances.
Wow, a real range of views there. How did Black Texans' opinions on deportation align with that spectrum?
Black Texans are generally less likely to support the deportation of all undocumented immigrants. Only 19% hold that view, compared to 39% of white Texans.
That's a significant difference. It suggests different understandings of immigration and its impact, different experiences, different values at play. Were there any key differences of opinion within the Black community itself on this?
Political party was a big factor. Black Republicans are much more likely to favor broad deportation policies, deporting all or most undocumented immigrants. Black Democrats, on the other hand, overwhelmingly prefer a policy of deporting only those who've committed crimes.
So once again, partisan affiliation seems to be playing a major role in shaping views on this complex issue. Okay, finally, let's talk about the 2024 presidential election. The survey asked people who they voted for. What did that reveal about voting patterns among Texans who participated in the poll?
Well, the survey data was very consistent with the actual election results. 55% of the Texans surveyed reported voting for Trump, 42% for Harris, and then just a small percentage for other candidates.
Okay, so a pretty accurate reflection of how the state voted overall. Now, I'm really curious about voting patterns within the Black community. Did the poll capture anything interesting there?
Yeah, we see a dramatic contrast. 78% of Black Texans reported voting for Kamala Harris in the 2024 election.
Yeah.
That's compared to just 35% of white Texans and 40% of Latino Texans.
That's a huge difference. What about Trump?
Only 19% of Black Texans said they voted for Trump. That's compared to 62% of white Texans and 58% of Latino Texans who voted for him. So again, a really striking difference in those voting patterns.
It really highlights the distinct political alignment of the Black community here in Texas. Were there any interesting internal variations in those voting patterns?
We did see some interesting trends. Black women were much more likely to vote for Harris than Black men, 86% compared to 65%. And Black men were more likely to vote for Trump, 31% versus 12%. Religious affiliation also played a role. Black Christians who aren't born again were significantly more likely to vote for Harris and less likely to vote for Trump compared to Black born-again Christians. And then, unsurprisingly, there's that very strong partisan divide. Almost all Black Democrats voted for Harris. Almost all Black Republicans voted for Trump.
It really underscores how many different factors are shaping political behavior, even within a single racial group. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. What are some of the key takeaways you think our listeners should keep in mind?
Well, I think this poll really reinforces the need to look beyond those simple statewide averages and to recognize the diversity of opinion within different communities, especially within the Black community here in Texas. We've seen significant differences between Black Texans and other groups on some really fundamental issues, things like abortion, marijuana, Medicaid expansion, and gun control. And even within the Black community itself, we've seen how those opinions can be shaped by factors like gender, age, political affiliation, and religion.
It's a powerful reminder that there's no such thing as a monolithic Black vote or Black opinion. It's a rich and complex tapestry, and those differing viewpoints are going to have real-world implications for policy decisions and political strategies.
Exactly. These findings should be a wake-up call for anyone trying to understand the political landscape of Texas.
Absolutely. So, as we wrap up, what's one key question you'd like our listeners to consider?
I'd ask them to think about what other underlying factors, beyond the demographics we've discussed, might be contributing to these differences in opinion. What are the historical, social, and economic forces at play? And how are those factors likely to shape the future of political debate and policymaking in Texas? It's a complex picture, but this poll gives us a really valuable snapshot to start unpacking it all.
Food for thought for sure. Well, thanks for diving into this data with me. It's been incredibly insightful.
My pleasure. It's always fascinating to dig into these nuances.
Absolutely. And to our listeners, thanks for joining us on the Deep Dive.